Well, thanks very much, Graham, and good afternoon, everybody. I should say I'm a remote sheep producer these days. My son does all the work and I just write out the cheques. Well, first of all, Graham mentioned I was asked to prepare the foreword for the book, and so what I'm going to say this afternoon draws heavily on the stuff I put together for that. Now, the CRC has been in existence in its various guises for almost 2 decades, and I think without any doubt, looking back, it's been a really very exciting 2 decades of innovation and change for the Australian sheep industry, and much of it has been facilitated by the work that's come out of the CRC. Today we've heard a lot about the successes, and tomorrow we'll hear some more. But I think if you try to put it into just a couple of sentences, it can be summed up, I think, quite simply, and that is that throughout the life of the CRC, it's maintained a single-minded focus on improving the Australian sheep industry. And when an idea is generated and tossed around, if you can't see how it can be translated into something that's of value to commercial producers or stud breeders, then it hasn't been started, and I think that's a great credit. There's been no curiosity research that hasn't been able to be translated somewhere down the track into something that's useful. Now, when we look at the history of this, I think it's always important to look at how things have emerged over time. Then how did we get to have a sheep CRC, and what are the really important drivers? Well, I think there are 2 decisions by the Australian government. They are totally unrelated, but the 2 things that have formulated the basis on which the CRC, the sheep CRC's been got going. The first one was the decision to start the CRC program itself. And the reason I say that is the CRC's offered 7-year funding, which was a long time by research funding standards. It required the industries to match or better the funding that the federal government was providing. And the combination of those 2 things made sure that the CRCs were focused on industry outcomes, because the industry money was in there churning around to make sure they got a benefit. And the other very important thing is 7 years funding allowed you to tackle some big science programs, and most importantly, and this is a good example from this CRC, to assemble teams of scientists who are in it for the long haul, because 7 years funding is a long time by research standards for researchers to be able to say, okay, I'll get in there, apply my wisdom and expertise, but I've got a job for 7 years, not have to keep looking around for the next grant in a couple of years' time. So that was very important, and if you turn back to the 90s, early 90s, and time when Australia was still saying we're riding on the sheep's back, then it was no surprise that one of the very early CRCs was the CRC for premium quality wool, which was set up in 1993. Now, the second unrelated decision from the Australian government was the decision in the early 90s to pull the plug on the reserve price scheme. Now, that scheme, I'm sure most people in the room are well aware of it, but it allowed the wool industry at the time to borrow large amounts of money to push the price of wool up, and if the market didn't pay the price, they bought the wool, and they ended up with a huge debt and 2 years of wool unsold. So it was in that climate, with a big overhang in the market for wool, prices tumbling, the wool CRC applied for an extension of more funding, and I was at the time on a panel the CRC program had to interview applicants for more money, and one of the questions that kept coming around to the application for that CRC was, well, talking about just the wool, what happened to the rest of the sheep, bearing in mind the wool price was just slowly going down. Now, so that bid was knocked back. But fortunately, there were people within the industry who obviously listening to what was going on. So soon, very soon, in 2000, back came a bid for a sheep CRC, the CRC for the Australian sheep industry. So wool, that was stopped, we got a Sheep CRC back, we got a Sheep CRC started, and that was really, I think, the start of everything coming together to look at the sheep, not just the wool or the meat separately. The first CRC had a very large number of interesting programs, but I think, as we've heard today, the one thing that really got moving successfully was the individual animal management, and we've had 2 or 3 speakers this afternoon talking about all the things that had flowed from that. I think I should have. Right, so then that first CRC wound up, and there was an application for a new CRC, and it was the CRC for Sheep Industry Innovation. And I think that CRC represented a very clear statement from industry research organisations, they are all in it, and indeed from industry peak bodies, that the focus was indeed on the sheep, not just on the wool or the meat. That CRC established programs on wool, on genetics, on meat quality, wool comfort, production management and extension. And a major innovation in that CRC was the establishment of the information nucleus, FLOC, which I think became the envy of the animal genetics world. It was a really successful program, generated a huge amount of very, very interesting and worthwhile information. That program integrated the emerging science of genomics into conventional breeding and offered the potential to incorporate so-called hard-to-measure traits into breeding programs and to increase the rate of genetic gain. And that, in combination, the industry was on a roll because demand for good quality lamb and mutton was also growing. When that CRC concluded, then a successful bid was made for an extension of the CRC funding until 2019, and that's the CRC that's just about to wind up. By this time, innovation was taken, I think, largely for granted in the industry, and the CRC was just known throughout the industry as the Sheep CRC. Research and commercialisation in that one continued on genomics, meat quality, individual management, and then there was some increased emphasis on sheep well-being and the application of big data, as we've heard earlier this afternoon. Now, over the time of all those CRCs, I've obviously been watching what's going on, and I was a participant for some time. I think it has been a really exciting time to be a producer, because you just see the benefits keep coming back. But these things don't always happen smoothly. There's always, in an industry that's got lots of budding politicians and others, there's always some hurdles to come across, and I just wanted to make a point about a couple. Firstly, in any innovation space, there'll always be some who don't see the potential benefits, or for their own reasons have preferred or prefer and argue for the status quo. And this applied in particular to the use of genomic information as part of breeding programs. And whilst there were many people in the industry, studs as well as commercial producers, who had an open mind about the adoption of genomics processes into conventional breeding selection, there were some, particularly within AWI and some of the stud breeders, who opposed it. But I think, as history shows, if it's good technology, then it will get adopted. And there was an author called Stuart Brand once said, once a new technology rolls over you, and if you're not part of the steamroller, then you're part of the road. And I think history shows, and will continue to show very clearly, that the Sheep CRC has been well and truly in the steamroller. Now, the second second issue that caused some degree of concern while I was the chair was all about the 7-year commitment. Now, when the CRC is set up, then all of the participants and the CRC board itself sign up with the Commonwealth that this is the program we'll implement, this is the funding that everyone will provide, and you've signed up for 7 years. Now, we had on a couple of occasions participants who decided, well, they wanted to actually decide year by year how much money they put in and also what the CRC should work on. Now, from our point of view, we had signed agreements in place. This was the commitment, so we just stuck to our guns, and I think that was without any doubt the final tipping point why AWI were not members of the CRC that was set up in 2014. They wanted to have more say year by year by year in how much they put in and in what was done. So it was really a great relief when we went through the rebidding process and the funders of the CRC said, okay, well, we'll give you the funding, and we got that funding in spite of the fact that one of the two major R&D bodies in the industry weren't supporting it. So that's a couple of lessons. I think it's about, think about what you're going to do, think long term, and then stay the course. There's always be someone who's trying to push you one way or the other. If what you want to do is you think has been well thought through and you're making progress, then stick at it and you'll get the rewards in the long run. Now, I just wanted to finish with paying two tributes. The first one is to the CRC program itself, and the second one is to all of the staff and board members of the CRCs that have made this progress. The CRC funding, as I've said, comes in long tranches. It's allowed ambitious research directions to be set and then to be delivered by stable multidisciplinary teams of eminent scientists and senior management. We've heard a lot about those successes, and I think without any doubt they've all done a great job. And I think it couldn't have been achieved if we had a funding system that was relied on short-term competitive grants, because no one would have had the vision to do the long-term work that we've been able to start and over, well, now nearly 20 years, bring it to fruition. And just as we needed the funding and the longer-term commitment from the people, I want to pay a particular tribute to James. He stayed the course the whole time, and he's driven this CRC in its 3 iterations, and we've got the results that everybody accepts and recognises. So James, well done. Now, the other thing I'd say is none of this could have been achieved without also having good management, great science people, and board members, some of whom have put in a very sterling effort over a long time. But they, in addition to the long-term funding, it's the commitment of the people that's been consistent. They believed in the vision and they just kept pursuing it. So to all those board members who've been there with me and before me and afterwards, well done to you too.